So for a long time, if anybody said anything about the role that the American states can play in our constitutional order, well, they would be dismissed. You're a neo-Confederate or some kind, whatever it was. But the states are, I mean, according to Jefferson, they really are the building blocks of the society, and they can do some good. If the federal government's out of control, they can do some good. In War of 1812, Daniel Webster, who later became a senator, was a congressman, said that if the federal government should even think about engaging in military conscription, Massachusetts would block that in Massachusetts. So, I mean, there have been numerous cases of people with very noble causes saying the states will stop this. We will stop this. And so what we've seen in recent years, and my friends at the 10th Amendment Center out in California have been at the forefront of this, is that the states have little by little started to become a little bit more imaginative, imagining what their role in all this might be. And so we've seen, for example, with things relating to marijuana legalization. Well, that's been happening in complete defiance of the federal government.
Yes.
But then on the other hand, we've seen, well, for example, in I think it was Maine, but some other places, and then eventually became a federal law, there were right to try laws in different states. If I'm terminally ill, there's an untested drug, I should have the opportunity to try it. That just seems like common sense. But the various states were just doing that, and they're not allowed to do that. So to see that, and then during COVID, I was not that impressed with most Republican governors, but there were a handful who used the powers they have as governors to say, well, we're not going to do X, Y, and Z in this state. And this state's going to be a little bit different. And so we had a control group. We could actually see, well, what happens in that state if they don't do A, B, and C? So it turns out that the American federal system is more robust than I feared it had become. I thought it had atrophied completely. And then I might add, my friends out at the 10th Amendment Center came up with an interesting idea, because they're not in favor, as most of us are not, of what the NSA is up to. And the thing is, yeah, the NSA might tell us, oh, we're not engaged in dragnet surveillance and just grabbing all this information. But maybe they're lying to us. Like, how do I know? And so they have a big facility out in Utah. And you think, well, what could the states do on that front? Well, it turns out their facility in Utah requires an absolutely ungodly amount of water to cool the machinery every day.
Oh,
it is
sure.
ungodly. I forget the number, but it is astronomical. And one guy at the 10th Amendment Center, I think Mike Meharry, said, what if Utah turned off the water? They're not under any obligation to supply the water. See, like, that's how we need to think creatively. We have think tanks with billion-dollar budgets who didn't think of anything like that, you know?
In an earlier video on our channel, I offered a little commentary basically suggesting that the path for this country is to Dobbs the hell out of everything. And by that I meant the Dobbs decision, which returned abortion policy to the states and stripped the federal government of its sort of de facto legalization in Roe versus Wade. Made it so that this highly contentious issue is now a state-based issue. I'm in Texas. I like that because I'm Catholic. I'm vehemently opposed to abortion. I think it's barbaric murder. Full stop. So I don't want it. I don't want it. Is it more complex than that because of the complexity of the rights of women as the carrier of the baby and that they have rights too? It is. And so in that respect, I say, look, in a morally perfect world, I would say it should just be banned altogether across from sea to shining sea. But I recognize this is a hard issue that is more complex than, say, slavery. And so let California be a place that I find like a morally repugnant hellhole for abortion. But if that's what you want for your family and for your daughters, go have at it. I get to be in Texas. You know, that's what you're talking about with federalism, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. And in a way, there's an analogy to if we think about, let's say, what were at one time called ladies of the night, let's say. Now, in the past, the way you would think about that is they don't call it the world's oldest profession for nothing. We probably can't stamp it out altogether. We have to be content with saying it'll be relegated to the bad part of town. And so the conservative point of view has typically been not that we can simply by brute force eliminate all evil everywhere. It's more that we recognize that evil is a mainstay of human existence, but we just simply do the best we can to hem it in. And that's what federalism can do.
Do you feel like the heat in our politics is a function of centralization? That what's happened today, that and the focus on the president, this single man being so make or break for all of our lives?
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that part of the underlying problem with our strife?
Yeah.
How do you think about that?
Oh, yeah, because every 4 years we have basically a low-intensity civil war. Who's going to be the one imposing his will on the rest of us? And this is the great model that the whole world should imitate. I'm not so sure about that. And so I think that it would be better for us to argue these things out with our neighbors and not sit there crossing our fingers that some judges might make a decision. These judges are not deities. They're basically just politically well-connected lawyers, and we're just going to see what they say. That's the idea. I can't imagine that's the most humane way to govern 300 and some odd 30 million people, something like that. But you mentioned the person of the president himself. Again, I tend to like to refer to Thomas Jefferson. That guy would be appalled at the cult of personality that's developed around the figure of the U.S. president. Like, we know what his golf handicap is and all. If he's out getting ice cream, we know about it. Jefferson would say, "You shouldn't know. This is stupid. Like, he's just a guy, and his job." It's hard to believe, but the role of the president is to humbly execute the laws. It's not to launch an ideological reconstruction program on the country. It's not to make the world safe for democracy. It's to humbly execute the laws. And when you look at the historians' rankings of the presidents, the ones who humbly execute the laws are at the dead last slots. Dead last.
Calvin Coolidge.
Right, exactly. Who was the humblest executor of the laws of all.
Silent cow, because people would go into his office asking for all manner of nonsense, and he would just stare at them.
Yeah, I know. I mean, he was just absolutely perfect. We would never be blessed with a guy like that again. But a lot of times people in history, now not always, this is not, as Mises would say, an apodictic certainty, but a lot of times in history when there's somebody both wings of the establishment love. So George W. Bush and Bill Clinton. If they both like somebody, you got to at least be wary. He might be okay, but you got to be wary. And a great example of that, when you ask Bill Clinton, who was your favorite Republican president? His answer was Teddy Roosevelt. Now, why was that? Because Teddy Roosevelt, a lot of the presidents of the 19th century, you never even heard their names before, Benjamin Harrison, most people, Chester A. Arthur, James Garfield, nobody knows any of these people. But Teddy Roosevelt was larger than life, and he brought that to the office, and he left an imprint on it. I mean, Mark Twain said, Teddy Roosevelt wants to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. Now, you have a guy like that in the office of president, it's going to shape that thing and create precedents for the future. So he had, I think it was 1903, he had a summit of coaches and players in college football at the White House because he thought college football was getting too dangerous. What does that have to do with the U.S. president? Don't we have a civil society where the leagues can arrange this themselves?
Teddy Roosevelt did this?
Teddy Roosevelt did this.
I'm kind of surprised that there was college football.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I mean, look, for heaven's sake, probably they're losing limbs, whatever. But the point, or he had a treaty that he wanted to pass with the Dominican Republic, and the Senate adjourned without taking action on it. And he was very impatient with that, so he said, "Well, how about if we just don't call it a treaty, and we'll just call it an executive agreement, and I will declare it passed." And that's what he did. And if the Senate doesn't like that, they can come back and change it, which, of course, they were cowardly then as they are now, and they just let it stand. When that guy becomes president, that is going to lead us almost inevitably down to where we are now, where this one man, we all look superstitiously to this one man. And I feel like our ancestors, whom we often like to laugh at how backward and primitive our ancestors were, as they're not as sophisticated and modern as we are, but they would be laughing at our superstitious reverence for this one man.
The structure of the Constitution sets up this challenge on purpose, these ties that bind and the separation of powers. It makes it hard to make changes happen. You want to do this? You need 3/4 of the states to cut on board if you want to change the Constitution. If you want to, get this passed, you need 2/3 majority of the Senate. You've got the Senate and the House. You've got the senators originally and properly appointed by state legislatures, so that technically they would be like representatives of the state interests, not just a higher version of your congressman. And then you've got the Supreme Court and the executive branch all in competition with each other, all designed to check power and also to constrain change and to moderate the whims of the people and majorities and fads, and also the whims of a tyrannical wannabe dictator. Have we crossed a threshold where those ties that bind have now locked us into having 75,000 pages of nonsense and a cult of the presidency that can't be unwound anymore? How do we... They did create a kind of ratchet effect on change and going backwards insofar as undoing some of this stuff seems hard in that structure.
Yeah, it is hard. I think some of the changes people want to make would be bad and make things worse. So on those days, when I think about that, I think I'm glad it's really hard to do anything. But on the other hand, I would say that sometimes because it's hard, I think what's happened is we've just decided, look, the Constitution is too hard to amend, and we want to do a lot of things that are not listed in Article 1, Section 8, so we're just going to go ahead and do them. And we'll come up with really lame justifications. We'll say the General Welfare Clause covers this, which it doesn't, or the Interstate Commerce Clause, or the Necessary and Proper Clause. And the thing is, we have all the commentary in the world about these clauses at the time. Even Alexander Hamilton, who wanted a more robust government, said that the Constitution in practice would be absolutely identical even if we had no Necessary and Proper Clause, which is the clause that your social studies teacher says allows them to do whatever they want. Well, Alexander Hamilton disagreed with that. So this is what in practice we now have, is that we have Supreme Court justices, some of whom are there just to put forth their policy preferences. Because look, the Constitution constrains us too much and it's too hard to change it. So we'll come up with convoluted justifications for what we want, trying to weave our way around all this language. And you see that in particular with the lionizing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And people loved Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Why? Because, quote, she fought for what she believed in. And I want to tell them that is exactly the opposite of what a Supreme Court justice is supposed to do. You are not supposed to fight for what you believe in. You're supposed to look at the facts of the matter, look at the Constitution, identify what the constitutional clauses in question were intended to mean, and we know that by looking at the ratifying conventions, and then make your decision. You are not supposed to fight for what you believe in. But for some people, that's the game. It's just, I just want to win. I don't need to have any principles. I just need to win. And the problem is, if somebody really is determined to win at all costs, and in effect tells you, I don't really have, my principle is that my side wins. I just saw on Twitter the other day somebody saying, it was a socialist, saying, the bourgeoisie will criticize me for not having principles, but you know what my principle is? The victory of socialism. And you wonder, if you have people who are that determined to win, regardless of what institutional constraints they're supposed to respect, are pitted against people who want to very carefully observe all the legal niceties. I'm kind of afraid that the more determined I'm going to win at all costs people are going to win.
If you like this clip, you should check out the full video and all the other great content we've got at Dad Saves America. So be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and ring that bell so you won't miss our new stuff as it drops each week.